There are over 85 leaders in the One Piece card game. It's quite a lot. Finding out which deck is for you is quite difficult if you don't know where to start, or if you're a new player. This video offers answers by showing the current best decks, the best new player picks, and then some fun recommendations on the side. I'll also be touching on the color pie itself, and some general prices. All to help answer the question, which One Piece deck is best for you? Let's start by explaining the color pie. Luckily, this format, all colors have strong options and can be competitively successful, but the mechanics you'll be interacting with change. Red is the color of power manipulation and aggro. You have the most rush units in the game, and most red decks like to play fast. You also have unique event synergy options, and the most recent red deck, Shanks, has turned what's usually offensive power manipulation into a powerful type of defense. Green is the color of board spam and resting manipulation. Most green decks can spam out boards incredibly quickly by cheating units in some form. Green can also restand units for extra attacks or freeze an opponent's board. This might be the worst color objectively, but it is fun. Blue is the color of value and control. You've got the best removal in the game and even options for hand control. Deck stacking, draw power, and bot deck removal are inherently just going to be broken mechanics. Purple is the color of Dawn manipulation. This means ramping quickly and paying Dawn itself as a cost. With such heavy cost, this means anything is possible. You have access to removal, healing, board spam, draw power, and really anything. You just have to know how to manage it. Yellow is the color of life manipulation. Healing, trashing an opponent's life, or stacking your own is all key parts of this color's gimmick. Yellow is also the color with the most triggers. Yellow tends to be top-end focus, but really, anything goes as long as it messes with life. Black is the color of KO removal and trash synergy. You get to quickly fill up your trash, then play units from it, all while removing your opponent's options. This color probably has the best staple cards, and it hard warps how every deck in the color is built. Now, the meta of the One Piece card game has been shifted by two massive developments. First, the release of 6 new starter decks that revitalized classic strategies and provided new generic support for each color. Second, the introduction of 6 new leaders from OP9 has allowed brand new playstyles to enter the metagame. From the new Blackbeard and Shanks, to the reintroduction of classics like Doflamingo, to the remnants of the previous meta like Rob Lucci and ST11 Luffy. OP9 has one of the most diverse metagames in One Piece's history. These 6 decks make it the majority of this format's top decks, with Doflamingo, Shanks, and Rob Lucci being the most popular. Now, if we go back to the big broad overview, we can see that there are quite a few rogue and playable decks. Most decks in this game aren't capable of winning competitive events. The rogue pool of decks is very deep, and 90% of leaders are viable on a local level. Just expect some leaders to take more effort than others. The first meta deck we'll talk about is Doflamingo, a unit spam menace with blue's best control options. Doflamingo on attack lets you reveal the top card of your deck and play it if it's a 4 cost or lower warlord. You get the stack top deck through cards like Perona, Buggy, and Boa Hancock. This deck stacking makes any potential plays you do extremely consistent, and even lets you dig for powerful options like Gravity Blade, Charlotte Pudding, and Perfume Fleur. The board spam is carried by Warlord Jembe, who makes any single play now a double. The deck also maintains value through Edward Weevil, Gecko Moria, and Trafalgar Law. All of this adds together to make one of the most viable packages in the game right now. Plus, it's one that can be mostly built from a starter deck, which, spoilers, is why I placed this deck on my new player recommendation list. The deck stacking and multiple uses of this deck's tools allow a good player to get a lot of mileage, but the power level of these tools also allow a new player to pick it up extremely quickly. If you want a competitive powerhouse that's fast and low to the ground, then it would be extremely hard to go wrong with Doflamingo. Plus, this deck is very affordable, especially for the power level. Shanks is a completely new take on red decks, boasting the new Red Hair Pirates engine, with options that trash instead of KO, leader power manipulation, and a new powerful 10-drop Shanks, which has both rush and a static power decrease. Bonkers card. While the leader effect is only okay, by combining it with the Red Hair Pirates package and generic red options, you can outtrade your opponent at every turn. Plus, you have a lot of removal, both directly through options like Whitebeard and Rayleigh, but also indirectly through 10-drop Shanks. The deck is very straightforward, which is where the biggest downsides are. both in how an opponent can expect to play around your specific options, but also in what do you want in a deck. Personally, I think it's very fun, but everyone's different. There are several builds to mess with, but the control-oriented build is likely better, but it's a question of how your locals plays or the competitive environment where you plan to play. This deck is likely to be somewhat unaffordable, needing some unreprinted cards like Silver's Rayleigh and some highly sought after new cards. Our last big 3 meta deck this format is Rob Lucci, the star of the OP7 and OP8 formats. This deck abuses Lucci Leader to both fill out graveyard and get more value from its KO cards. This deck is also notorious for getting absurd value from Gecko Moria, being able to conduct a combo that goes Gecko, Rebecca, Helmeppo, Spandime, Rob Lucci for a whopping 21 Dawn in value for just 8 investment. While this deck is still absurdly strong, other colors are getting better at breaking its tempo and outmaneuvering its resources, especially in the early and mid game. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still one of the best decks in the game, and it's an excellent choice if you like decks that use their graveyard as a resource. Manipulating your smaller pieces in the early game to set up your big plays later is just super fun to do. Luckily, this deck has dropped in price quite a lot since the reprint set, but it's still quite a bit, needing some non-reprinted cards like Sabo, Jack, and Brook. Structure Deck Luffy is a combo machine. The goal is to use leader skill, Gecko Moria, and 2 baby brothers to set your leader to 9k base power and fill the board with blockers and removal options. Going to this state over and over again is an absurdly powerful win condition, and there's not another deck that plays like it, but this is also where the deck's main problems arise. It's very skill intensive to get to this point in your games. You will be getting into mind games with your opponent, since any decent player will delay setting your life to 0 or even ticking it down. You do have all sorts of interesting options in counterplay to take your own life and set up leading value plays, but using them optimally is hard. Thus, it needs a good player to deal with a wide variety of matchups and playstyles. But if you're good, this deck can take you to the top. Maybe even being the strongest deck in the game, but only if you're good enough. The deck is also expensive, needing a lot of staples and an expensive starter deck. Purple Luffy is a generic tempo deck, supplemented by some easy ramp on leader skill. Purple Straw Hats enable some excellent board spam thanks to 7-drop Luffy, while also having amazing top-end rush thanks to the Purple Rush Luffy and Rush Sanji. The real kicker comes from all the draw power this deck has. Queen, Onami, Frankie, Sanji, and the notorious Gum Gum Giant let you maintain hand size and filter new options while progressing through your basic plays. It's a great deck, and it's also on my recommendation list for new players. While being buildable from a starter deck, this strategy does require a few more outside pieces, so it will be relatively expensive. But the simple nature and fun options make this a perfect deck for a new player to start learning the game with. Enel is a stall late game turbo heal deck. The leader's gimmick means an opponent needs to win at least 3 attacks to kill you from 1 life. This means that an opponent needs to have a very large board presence to even try to go for game. So, we can make it to late game, where we can spam yellow's top end and just out-heal and out-grind our opponents. It also helps that this deck has some of the most obnoxious triggers known to man. A 50-50 blend of removal and stall. It's a great strategy, and the best yellow has to offer at the moment. But it also has a few big issues. First, the deck is expensive. You need a lot of secret rares, and literally every expensive SR in yellow. Second, this deck has some difficulty in its matchups. While some are almost auto wins, such as Doflamingo, others like Blackbeard will just run right through you. Even for your 50-50 matchups, it can come down to luck more than you'd really like. But for players who do like how yellow plays, it's hard to recommend a better deck. Just understand what you're getting into. Marshall D. Teacher Blackbeard is one of the most unique decks in this meta. You have the ability to turn off your opponent's on-play abilities, which nukes a lot of the best options this format. However, you can't activate any on-play abilities yourself, meaning you can't rely on staple black cards. So you'll find yourself experimenting with the unpopular pool of non-on-play cards, most commonly Laboon, Jack, and Finger Gun. Of course, supplementing this playstyle is its unique line of Blackbeard pirates. Jesus Burgess has gigantic numbers, Liberation is a negate then a KO, which is wild, and of course, the all-powerful 10-drop Blackbeard is both a 12 power blocker, then a negate of your opponent's leader skill, and then a freeze and a negate of a unit. It's a wild win condition that just needs you to get to late game. This deck has a similar problem to Enel. Some matchups are just going to be rough, and some are going to be auto wins. As such, it takes a surprisingly skilled player to manage your typically weaker options and correctly use your leader skill. If you get it right, you can win most of your games, but this is a deck that rewards players for learning, and you will improve with it over time. Now we move on to my new player picks. These were chosen based on a few key points. First is the ease of building. This means both in total price and from being tied to a starter deck. There's 5 starter deck picks here this time. Second is ease of play. Decks in this section aren't going to be absurdly difficult to pilot. If you want those, check my Monkey's Pick section later. And every deck in this section is fun to play. All of these decks have that in spades. Also do note, but Doffy and Luffy, 2 meta decks, are on here as new player picks. If you want to go competitive to start, I do recommend them. First, let's start with our new player pick, Whitebeard. This deck does a few unique things. First, you've got a 6k base leader, letting you freely be aggressive and forcing your opponent to waste Dawn to try to attack you. Second, you add a card from your 6th life to hand each turn, rapidly building hand size and ramping up advantage. Lastly, this deck gets to take advantage of all the Whitebeard exclusive support, like both of the Rush Aces and Atmos to manage your life. It's a fun strategy that gives new players some wiggle room to learn, and is buildable mostly from a starter deck. It's a great choice. Plus, it can be pivoted into other decks like Marco Ace and even Shanks. And even more on the positive side, it's also pretty cheap. There are gonna be some downsides though. Whitebeard likes to get into a position where it has no life and a million cards in hand. Most meta decks can break this, and blue has cards that directly counter this, so you do end up having to be quite clever in these matchups, or risk losing outright. Plus, generic red staples don't get as much mileage as they used to. Still a fun deck, and an easy recommendation despite its flaws. But if Whitebeard or Shanks aren't fast enough for you, Red Zoro has your back. Zoro simply gives a power boost to all units on your field when Zoro has a Dawn. This means that all those cheap garbage units suddenly hit for decent damage, and large swings become unguardable. This would be just okay on its own, but thanks to Zoro's son, Tony Chopper, we get an absurdly efficient means to body spam. Chopper states on play and on attack, he gets to play an animal with an attack of 4k or less from the top 5 cards of your deck. Combine that with another Tony Chopper that plays an animal from your hand, and an event that plays an animal from deck, and you get a free board of units each turn. It's wild fun. You don't even have to care if much of your board gets removed, because you can just play out a new one, and if that doesn't work, just finish up the game with a Diablo Jambe, a 5-cost Rush Luffy, or a Monkey D Dragon. It's an easy recommend if you like fast decks. Outside of the blocker Tony Chopper, it's pretty cheap too. The downside is, you do have to be prepared for late game, where other decks will very quickly stabilize and try to shut down your strategy. So you're gonna have to go faster or have a win button. Kalgara is an interesting deck. If you're strictly looking for the cheapest but still playable deck in the game, then this technically is it. Kalgara can be built for roughly $20, since he's all commons and rares. A technicality, which makes him the only playable budget yellow deck. Although I do recommend some number of Rush Aces, which would technically bump up the price, but they're not strictly needed. Kalgara is a board spam deck that takes his own life to play Shandian Warriors from the hand. The Shandian Warriors and Sky Island cards are all gimmicked around playing and recycling the upper yard stage and searching for more gas. Plus you have access to Nolan LeBlanc, who is a flat heal. It's all very fast paced, and it either wins or loses very quickly. Surprisingly, the deck does have some consistency issues despite all the searching. You want to see multiple copies of Nolan LeBlanc, and it can be rough if you don't. It might be a bit weaker than the other options, but it's one of my personal favorite decks in the game. Plus, if you do want to spend money, the alternate arts are beautiful. Green Uta is a weird one, needing 2 different starter decks right off the back. But it only needs 1 card outside of those 2 starter decks, Eustass Captain Kidd. What Uta does as a leader is allow you to draw an additional card each turn. Almost everything in your deck is going to be film, so it'll work out. The film engine lets you spam board, and consists of a larger than normal number of blockers. This means you can build problems and overwhelm an opponent between giant rolls, giant hand size, and your leader's ability to restand thanks to I'm Invincible. It's honestly a great but slept on deck. This deck is amazing, and is good against the majority of the more moderate and just okay decks in the game. Its issue comes from struggling with hand control, also known as blue, or extreme board wipe decks like Rob Lucci. Still, it's an easy recommend if you want to play a film-themed deck, or just with green in general. Your only other options are going to be Bonnie, Carrot, and Perona, which can be very rough. Lastly, for my new player picks, I have Smoker, a once forgotten Navy turbo deck that is thriving thanks to new support in the starter decks. The full Navy engine lets Smoker do two things. It KOs anything that breathes, and sets up massive graveyard piles for use with Gecko or Moria. While Smoker as a leader is honestly pretty weak, two specific deck options drive up this leader. Sengoku, who's a 1-cost discard 2 draw 3, and Tashigi, who gets the KO a 0 cost and give an opponent's unit -4. It's a bit more roundabout than Rob Lucci, but it's a much more dynamic deck. It's a really good introduction to black decks in general. The Navy engine is fun and it builds into a lot of other playstyles. Most everything in this deck is cheap thanks to the reprint set, but I do need to warn you that Brook is just expensive. He is half the cost of this deck, including the structure decks, and I do feel he's required with how Smoker works as a deck. Now we get to a section of decks called Monkey Recommends. These decks might be too expensive, too weak, or too hard to play to either place in meta or the new player section of the video. But each deck here is both very interesting and very fun. These decks also all have new options from this format specifically. First up is Nico Robin. Nico Robin has Banish on leader and gets to trash a trigger to ramp. We get a second puzzle piece when we see that Robin's unique support lets her search trigger cards. This is one of those decks where if you give the cards to 20 different people, you'll get 20 different deck lists. But if I had to settle on one, I'd go with the style of list popular in Japan. We're using a core of generically broken yellow triggers and yellow heal top end to outvalue our opponent. We do run a few purple cards for extra draws and value, like Rush 9-drop Luffy, but overall, this is mostly a yellow deck. Our goal is to make our opponent miss resources thanks to leader Banish and 6-drop Nico Robin trashing the card. If we do it right, it makes our okay yellow top end much more devastating since our opponent won't have the resources to effectively deal with it, especially not if we're ramping. This deck does have a lot of room for techs, even in this playstyle. You can run Gum Gum Giant for more draws, Katakuri for utility and removal, Shohoshi for matchup specific help, or Kikanojo because why not? It's a niche deck that really rewards the player for being responsive to changes in the larger meta and creating the best possible list. It's an easy recommend if you want to play a yellow deck that's not stale like Enel can often be. Carrot is one of my favorite decks in general. The concept comes from a few places. First, we can use leader skill to deny life by generating board pressure instead. Second, we can use the absurdly broken field spell Zo to generate extra Dawn and restand units. This could just be used to get extra damage and go unpunished, but we can combo it with the You Can Be My Samurai engine to draw millions of cards and do so much searching, we can map out the entire deck and change its order. Third, we still have a ton of stun effects. From Carrot being bonkers, to Inarashi nuking Doflamingo, to 10-drop Dolphy nuking everything. It's really cool. If you're willing to grind out a deck and learn tons of hard matchups, then this deck is for you. Plus, I have a really in-depth deck profile going over how it works. It's one of my best. Of course, I do have to mention other playstyles for Carrot. You can combo it with the Donquixote Pirates for more consistency, or just as the PR Mink experience. But I stand by my build as the best. Mono Red Sanji is one of the best designed leaders that Bandai has ever released. His effect turns any red unit without an on-play effect into a rush unit. This turns what can be good on its head and enables players to run a ton of forgotten and previously weak options. Of course, it's going to be an aggro playstyle, using a lot of the same core of other red decks, but we get unique techs like Pell, a strong KO unit, Wapple, an absolutely bonkers power manipulation, and you'll get new synergy out of cards like Life Takes Sanji, and old starter deck 1, Zoro. It all just works incredibly well together. The downside is that this playstyle has the same aggro problems of every other deck in the game. You do run out of resources eventually, but I think a good player who keeps an eye out for better techs can get this deck to be a top contender. Eustass Captain Kid was the worst of the 3 captains in Structure Deck 10, however, after one of them was taken out back, we are now the second best leader. Plus we got new support in OP9. Kid as a leader has two gimmicks. First, you get 5 life, but start at 4k base power on your turn. Second, you can on attack Dawn -1 to get an extra 2k power. So you'll get extra life padding in an aggro deck, and can afford to take life away through effects. But that Dawn minus on demand is more important. It lets you synergize immediately with cards like Charlotte Pudding, Eustass Captain Kid Blocker, and Beppo, which is surprisingly powerful. This deck also gets new support, which lets you restand the leader, allowing for truly stupid plays, since Kid's attack gain effect isn't once per turn. And while I honestly don't think it's optimal to run it, you should run Punk Rotten for even larger numbers. You also still get access to all the funny red rush units, and Kid and Killer is searchable in this deck, which does unfathomable things. There's a ton of ways to build this leader, and it's super rewarding to mess with. Even if you don't like my dumb build, I fully recommend trying something out with this amazing leader. Red Purple Uta does two things. It ramps into 2 strong colors for top end, red and purple. And Uta also has synergy with film engines, straight up ramping into broken top end like 10 cost Shanks and Purple Heal Big Mom, or even the 7 and 8 cost options like Monkey D Dragon and Whitebeard, let you counter and outvalue any opponent in the game. Between leader skill and a ramp, you hit this a turn early. Or you could use a draw option like Queen or Guild Tesoro and still not lose tempo. Speaking of Guild Tesoro, that's our next best thing. We get synergy with film units. While most are janky and impossible to use, Guild Tesoro lets us recur 2 units from trash, effectively letting us loop our 2k counters. We also have Blocker Shariah, which counters leader-based gimmicks. It's all a bit clunky, but still a solid base for synergizing with our better options. And you really do have a ton of juice combos. For example, Uta skill and Karina Blocker synergize with Whitebeard's KO effect. And if you really want dumb stuff, think about running the card Lily Carnation in combination with the later releasing Straw Hat support in Starter Deck 21. But that's a thing for later. I recommend Red Purple Uta to anyone who likes to play ramp, but with a bit more of an aggressive flair. Marco is really one of the coolest designs for a leader. It has deck stacking, filtering, power manipulation, and Whitebeard typing in both of its colors. You can do all sorts of crazy things, such as get value from the rush aces, play any unit with 9 cost Sanji, and KO a lot of an opponent's units with Rayleigh. Your only problem is that you're a 4-life leader that's also kinda slow, so it needs a really good player to make these options work. Between figuring out text to optimizing a list to actually piloting that list, it's a lot. If you want a deck that's a large time investment with untapped potential, then this is it. Marco will always be getting new stuff to take advantage of, and it's up to you to figure it out. Like Marco, Purple Black Luffy offers a perfect combination of synergies. It gets the best of Purple Straw Hats and innovative ramp, as well as the best of Black Straw Hats with cost manipulation and Gecko Moria. On paper, this deck gets to run about 20 to 24 cards with draw effects, which is just insane. Plus you can recur them with Gecko Moria for more value. Theoretically, with your leader skill, you can just outmaneuver an opponent with more Dawn plays. There's just one problem. You're a 4-life leader that's kinda slow. So you have to get very creative with your early game options, and make sure to maximize those super impactful late game swings and tempo. You have to be a dedicated player to make this work. But it's one of the most interesting decks this format, and I hope more people play it. And that's all for this OP9 edition of Which Deck Is For You. It's a great new format, and I'm excited with how Bandai has been moving forward with this game. OP10 and onward seem to be revisiting old themes with new gimmicks and new support. So, of course, I'm excited. Please subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.